is Kuf Lamed Zayin. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, good. 137, and he got up to, I believe, around 9 lines down. Amar Abaya.
Oh,
We can go back. It's okay. It's the
yeah.
conclusion of the sugya. But let me start from the first word. How about that? I'm going to start from Tanahi, okay? Because it's also, I mean, so the problem is it's not a great natural place to start. But yesterday's discussion was about an interesting machloket that we've had many, many, many times, which is whether kinyan perot kinyan guftami, right? If I sell someone something or give someone something in this case, or you can sell as well, and I give you the rights to it, but I don't give it to you permanently. And in this case, the example was where I said to someone, I'm giving this to you, but when you die, it goes to someone else, right? You give it to Ruvain, Acharecha, it goes to Ploni, it goes to Shimon. So in that case, clearly Ruvain doesn't have full possession over it because it's going to go to someone else after him. So the question is that kinyan that he has in it enough to be considered that he is part of the guf of the thing? And the one of the consequences of that machloket, which we discussed yesterday, is what if the person sells it, right? Can Reuven actually sell it? So we said yesterday, I think it was yesterday, that you definitely can sell it for the fruits, right? Meaning Reuven has the rights to this thing until he dies. He can say to a stranger, I'm selling you the rights to, the rent from this tree or all the payroll from this tree until I die. So everyone agrees you can do that. The question is, can you sell the land itself? Can you send the ikr thing? And so we had a machloket about that yesterday. And the Gemara says, I'm going to start from the first word on Kuf Lamed Zayin, even though I know some of you already did it yesterday, that Tanaihi, in fact, this is a machloket Tanaim, meaning there's different, although we've had a machloket yesterday, Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, there's actually a deeper machloket, earlier machloket between Tanaim, the Tanya. As the Braita says, top line of Kuf Lamed Zayin, Amud Aleph. The Braita says, if a person says to somebody else, Nichasai lecha, I'm giving you my possessions, ve'acharecha leploni. But after you die, I want it to go to the next person. So it's not yours forever, which is you could just say, I'm giving it to you. So it gives it to Ruvain, and then he gives it to Shimon. And Yarad Rishon Umachar v'achal, and the first one goes down to the field and he sells it. So instead of him enjoying it, he sells it to somebody else, and that other person uses it. Then when Ruvain dies, Hasheni motzi miyad lekuchot. Shimon can then come and say to the person who bought it, you were lucky, you got this for 10 years while Ruvain was alive. Ruvain is dead, and when Ruvain dies, it goes to me. Divrei Rebbe. Now that implies that kinyan haperot is not kinyan haguf, so that the person cannot really sell it for after his death. He can sell it while he's alive, but that he can only sell the fruits. He can't sell the actual property. That's Rebbe. But Rebbe Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, ein l'sheni elamash rishon. No, the only thing the second one gets is what's left in the possession of Ruvain when he dies. If Ruvain sold it, Shimon's out of luck. If Ruvain sold half of it, Shimon will get the other half. So he doesn't get anything, and that is the opinion that Rabbi Yochanan adopted, that kinyan perot is kinyan haguf. That's Rabbi Yochanan's opinion. Rish Lakish is a lot more complicated. He would say everyone agrees with him, and this case is different because you use the word acharecha. So that is one Braita. Ask the Gemara now, fifth line from the top, Veramini, but we have a contradiction from another Braita, because this Braita says something very different for the same people. It says, if you say, Nichasai lecha v'acharecha leponi, which is the exact same case we just had, then, says this Braita, not the first one can sell it, and if the first one sells it, the second one can take it away, Yotzi miyad lekuchot. But in fact, this Braita says, Yored harishon umachar va'ochel, that the first one can go down and sell it, and the person he sells it to can eat it. Divrei Rebbe, which is not what Rebbe said before. Rebbe said before that the second one can then go and collect it from the first one. And I'm not from the first one, from the person who bought it, from the lekuchot. Divrei Rebbe, and Reb Shimon Gamliel says in this Braita, Ein l'rishon al achilat perot bovad. The first one only gets to eat the fruit. So again, that's a contradiction. Rabbi Yochanan, Shimon ben Gamliel, we just understood him to say that kinyan perot is kinyan haguf, and therefore the first one could sell anything they want. So what do you mean you can only sell the fruit? You should be able to sell the land. So Kasha the Rebbe ad the Rebbe and Kasha the Reb Shimon Gamliel Reb Shimon Gamliel. Says the Gemara, Rebbe ad Rebbe lo Kasha halagufa halapera. No, the difference is whether the first guy, Ruvain, sold the field to sell the field, in which case when he dies, Shimon can go to the buyer and say, okay, give me the field back, or the case where Ruvain sold the field only for the purpose of eating the fruit while he's alive. in which case Reuven sold it to a stranger and said, you can eat all the food from this field while I'm living. Once he dies, he can't eat the fruit anymore, but there's nothing to collect, right? That's permitted. And Reb Shimon ben Gamliel kasha halechatchila hadi avad. One is what you're supposed to do. We're going to see it more in a second. That obviously, if a person goes to Reuven and says, "Here, I want to give you this field, and when you die, I want it to go to Shimon," the intent of the donor, right, is that it should go to Shimon. Now, Reuven has the ability, because he's now has a kinyan perot, which is kinyan aguf, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. He can sell it, but that's not nice, right? Because the intention clearly is to give it, enjoy the fruit. When you die, give it to Shimon. But that doesn't mean halachically you can't do that. So Rabbi Yochanan in one case says you should just eat the fruit. That's what you're supposed to do. But b'diavad, if you sold it, the next guy can't collect it from the person you sold it to. Continues the Gemara today. Amar Abaya, we had a list, if you recall, in Masechet Sota, I think we had, of all kinds of bad people. And one of them was someone called a Rasha Arum, which means Arum doesn't mean naked in this case. It means like tricky, right? Like it means in the pasuk, right? A Rasha who's very sneaky, very deviant. So what is a Rasha?
Cunning evildoer.
What did you say?
A cunning evildoer.
Okay. Cunning, right? I guess that's, so Arum means cunning. Yeah, sure. So what is a Rasha Arum, which is a particularly bad person? This is someone, Rashbam points out very clearly, it's not the person who sells, right? You gave this field to Reuven and said, after you die, give it to Shimon. Reuven said, oh, wow, someone offered me $1 million for the field. He sold it, right? So Reuven's not a nice guy because the person who gave it to him really wanted to go to Shimon, but he did it because he got $1 million. The Rasha Arum is the tax advisor who says to Reuven, oh, wait a second, you could get a great deal. You can sell this field and keep all the money, right? So he's messing over Shimon, but also he's going against the intentions of the giver, and he's gaining nothing out of it. So this is how we always talk about Rasha Arum. We talk about when we get to Lashon Hara, we'll talk about the snake the same way, right? Where basically you gain nothing out of it, but you cause someone else to lose. And so that is the person, not the one who does it, but the one who gives the advice. And of course, that's like Reb Shimon Gamliel. According to Rebbe, you can't do it at all. Rebbe holds kinyan perot is lavki kinyan haguf, and therefore, if you sold it, it would go back to the Shimon when Reuven died. Amar Reb Yochanan halacha Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. Says Reb Yochanan, which we knew already, because Reb Yochanan paskin kinyan perot kinyan haguf. Halacha is like Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. Umoda. Now, however, Reb Shimon ben Gamliel admits. Remember, Reb Shimon ben Gamliel's halacha is that if you give away a field to one person and say after you die, give it to the next person. That person, Reuven in this case, actually owns the guf of the field. And although the intent is for him not to give it over, if he sells it, he's allowed to sell it and he can keep the money, because kinyan perot is kinyan haguf. However, says the Gemara, says Rabbi Yochanan, Moda, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel is Moda Shem Natan b'matnat shchiv mira lo asaklum. Fascinating. That if a person on their deathbed, this is the easier case, a person on their deathbed says, I want this field. So again, someone, I don't have a name for the person, someone donated a field and gifted a field to Reuven and said to Reuven, after you, it should go to Shimon, right? And Reuven is on his deathbed and Reuven is about to die and he remembers, oh my gosh, this field is going to go out of my family. I've got a great idea. I want to give it to pick someone else, right? I own it. I could sell it according to Rabbi Yochanan. I want to give it as a gift to my son, let's say, or to a stranger, right? So that is called a matnat shchiv mira, matana given on a person's deathbed. That does not work, lo kana. It doesn't go to the other person. It goes instead to Shimon. Why not? Because lo asaklum. Sorry, you didn't do anything. My taima, Amar Abaya, because the halacha is, it's a fascinating halacha, that matnat shchiv mira lo kana ela la'achar mita. A person who's dying and says, I want to give something to somebody else, he means, or she, when I die, right? Dying is usually a process, and shchiv mira is in the process of dying, but it doesn't go to the other person until that person dies, right? Now, when they die, at that point, it's too late, because kfar kadmu acharecha. Shimon gets it when Reuven dies. So it's all essentially maybe even simultaneous, but the point is that the matnat shchiv mira does not happen at the beginning of death or during the process of death. It happens at the conclusion of death. And at that point, because the first giver said, once you die, Reuven, it goes to Shimon, you can't change that. Now, just to be clear, Reuven could have sold it while he was alive, and he could give it away while he's alive, according to Rabbi Yochanan, to Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. But if he says it in a way that's a matnat shchiv mira, it doesn't work. Ask the Gemara, is that true? Did Abai really say that? We have a beferish statement where we say the following: Matnat shchiv mira me'ematai kana. It's a great question, right? A person is on their deathbed. They make an announcement. They say, I'm giving my possessions. Remember, we always trust a shchiv mira. You don't have to actually make a kinyan. You don't have to do all the regular stuff, right? Because he's dying. When does that work, right? And it's obviously very relevant for many reasons, but one is for this kind of case. So when is that? Me'ematai kana. When is the person kona the possession from the dying man? Abaya says, im gemar mita. Abaya says it happens when im gemar dita, with the moment of death. And Rava says, la'achar gemar mita. No, it happens after he's dead. So we just said it happens according to Abaya after he's dead. And that's why if a person says, here's a gift to Reuven, and when Reuven dies, it goes to Shimon, it will go to Shimon. So how can Abaya have said earlier in this other statement that a matnat shchiv mira happens with the death, not after the death? That would contradict this. Says Gemara, you're right. Abaya changed his mind. Hadar be Abaya miyahi. Abaya used to think that. He gave it some more thought. He was convinced that that's a mistake, and that in fact a gift of a shchiv mira does not happen with death. It happens after death. In which case, if something else happened at death, that would be more important. Says Gemara, how do you know that? How do you know Abaya changed his mind about that fact? Maybe he changed his mind about the first fact, right? Abaya first told us that if someone gives a gift to Reuven and says after Reuven dies, it goes to Shimon, and then Reuven on his deathbed says, I want to give it to Levi, it doesn't go to Levi, right? Because when Reuven died is when it went to Shimon, and only afterwards is his gift effective. And then Abaya is quoted as saying that a shchiv mira gives a gift while he's dying. So we said that's incorrect. Abaya changed his mind. How do you change his mind from the second one? Maybe he changed his mind from the first one. Mimai demiahi hadarbe. How do he change his mind from the second halacha? Dilma meha hadarbe. Maybe he changed his mind from the first halacha that it goes to Shimon, not to some other stranger. Says Gemara, you're right. But lo sagadaitach. In fact, if you look at the Mishnah, what Abaya said seems to contradict the Mishnah, right? Abaya would not want to contradict the Mishnah, of course, because the Mishnah says it's none. We had this Mishnah, if you recall, in Masechet Gitin. The Mishnah said, let's say a person says to someone, zegitech imati. This is your get if I die. Right? A person's sick. We'll see the cases in a second. But either way, I'm the person's sick. If I die, this is the get, which of course would be very functional, helpful, because then she doesn't, if a man dies and he don't have children and he's got a brother, the wife his widow has to either be miyabem or do chalitza. So he says, look, I want to stay married to you, or I want to stay on your health insurance, maybe, right? But if I die, I don't need that anymore. And here's your get. Or you say, Zegitech michol izeh. Remember, we talked about all these cases. This is your get if I die from this illness, because he's afraid, he might get better from this heart attack, but have a different illness. He's not sure if he wants to divorce her. Or Zegitech lachar mita. In all of these cases, lo amar klum, it has no effect. And the reason it has no effect is that the assumption from the Mishnah is that a person says something happens when I die, they mean after I die. In which case, of course, once he died, she's a widow. She no longer can be divorced, right? You can't divorce a woman who's already a widow. So just like by divorce, again, it's not divorce that we're talking about here. It's the meaning of the terminology. When a person says, with my death, this should happen, they usually mean, we think, after I'm dead. And once you're dead, something else already happened. In a woman's case, she's already a widow. And in the case of a gift, it already went to Shimon. And so because the Mishnah seems to support that, we assume that Abaya is more likely to hold that opinion and to have gone back from his earlier opinion.
It also would mean that if he tells her that he would give her a get after he died, that he can keep her earnings all during that time. Okay.
Did we lose him?
Yeah, and gone. Nobody.
I'm here.
Marion, you kicked him out.
I'm here. You can't hear me?
I can hear you, but your comment, he must have left. He was offended.
It must have been.
Gone.
It's the fire.
Finally got to him.
Wow. Okay.
Gone. Finished.
Give him a couple of minutes. His internet must be unstable.
He doesn't know. Give
No,
him a-
I mean he's off. He's completely off. So
He doesn't know that probably. You have to give him a phone call.
I can text her. Oh, no, he hears.
Sorry, everyone. That was me, right?
Yeah, I didn't realize that was such like a terrible comment I made. Did you hear
No,
it
I
at
know what you
all?
said, but no, I didn't hear what you said.
Okay, I said it also means if he gives her a get, like that he says he won't give it to her until he dies, it means that he keeps her earnings during all that time, rather
Right.
than like, you know.
Correct. I mean, yes. I mean, obviously, we're not sorry about that. I'm now on my phone, so hopefully it'll be more effective. But this, I mean, there are cases. Tosus actually, the Rashbam, sorry, the Rashbam's on both sides of the stuff, so it gets a little confusing. You think he's Tosus, but on Kuf Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph, the Rashbam quotes some of the opinions that argue with this in the Masechet Gitin, that there are cases where we view this as Mehayom Lachar Mita, Rabbi Yossi's opinion. So remember, this was a very large discussion in Masechet Gitin, but the bottom line is, according to our Gemara's saying it, the way we're saying a Stam Mishnah, which the Rashbam points out, it's not really a Stam Mishnah. I mean, there's other opinions, is that it seems to be only effective when the person dies. Okay, sorry about that.
Yeah.
Continues the Gemara now. Sorry?
I
Nope.
just said yes, I agree.
Okay. Says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Zera, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Halacha Reb Shimon Gamliel. The halacha is like Reb Shimon Gamliel, again, that a person who gets a gift of an object, and then they say, the gifter says, after you die, I want it to go to someone else, Zacharecha to Ruvain or to Shimon, then the halacha is that you can give it away, you can sell it during that time, even though it's not the intention of the giver. And even, says the Gemara today, even says Rabbi Zera, Afilu hayben avadim, hotzian lecherut. Even if he gave you slaves, right? Let's say a person gifted his slave to Ruvain and said, Ruvain, when you die, I want the slave to go to Shimon. And Ruvain is a very kind-hearted person, let's just say, and he frees the slave. So that is effective. Says Gemara, okay, Pshita, that's the same thing. If you can sell a field, you can free a slave. Says Gemara, no, because I'm not so sure about that. Ma'adatema, I would have thought that Amar Le, that the giver would say, L'me'avid isur lo yavin lecha. Remember, we've learned that it's prohibited, not prohibited meaning it's effective, but it's not encouraged to free a slave. It says, L'olam bahem ta'avodu, that a person who becomes a slave in Evi Kanani should be a slave forever. You're not supposed to free them. Again, we discussed that also, just to remember, in Nashim, right, in the end of Ketubot and elsewhere. So, L'olam behem ta'avodu, and therefore, sorry, in Kiddushin. Therefore, we have thought that you could say, look, I gave a gift, but I didn't expect the person to do something that was against the rules. And if he does, it's going against my intention, and I didn't mean to give the gift in that way. But it says where it's not the case, right? Kamash Malan, that look, you give a gift, you just give it, whatever the person does with it is your business, unless you explicitly say otherwise, right? Amar of Yosef, Amar of Yochanan again, Halachakrim Shimon Gamliel, Va'afilo asan tachrichim lamet. Right? Let's say a giver has this beautiful suit and he gives it to Reuven. He says, Reuven, I want you to have the suit. And when you die, I want it to go to Shimon. I want it to go to Levi, right? You want to give it to all your friends. But Reuven has a great idea that when he dies, he'll be buried in the suit, right? If you choose to be buried in the suit, that calls tachrichim. And as we learned, if something is officially tachrichim, it's asur b'hana. You're never allowed to use it, and no one else can use it, right? So says the Gemara, even now, of course, not after he died, but even if he made it into tachrichim, then that's his right to do it. Pshita says Gemara, again, it's the same obviousness. I would have thought the shvinyo isuria hana lo yavin lecha, that you would say the same thing, that the giver might say, look, I gave it to you clearly with the intention to use it. I didn't mean for you to destroy it. Basically, you've turned it into tachrichim, which are something that no one can ever use ever again, even you, right? Unless you're dead, but no one can use them. So you would have thought that that does not comport with the original intent of the gift, and therefore it's null, kamashmon, that you can do whatever you want with it. Darish Rav Nachman bar Rav Chisda, we are 6 lines from the bottom. Says Rav Nachman bar Rav Chisda in the same vein as what we've been talking about. Let's say a person says to somebody else, and this you can imagine was very common, right? They didn't, like us, have factory farming, maybe, and they also didn't have a lot of other things like irrigation. And so it was very hard to find an etrog sometimes. Now, in Israel, they grow everywhere, but I guess in some places, maybe in Bavel, there were not many etrogim. And so it was very common. Of course, the Rashbam talks, I think, on Amabet, about in his community in Europe, this was always the way they did it, that one person would have an etrog and they would all share it, right? Because obviously in Germany or in 13th century, it was probably very hard to find an etrog. But certainly in the times of the Gemara, if let's say you have a person who has an etrog and he says to somebody else, look, I want to give this to you. And after you use it, give it to the next guy, to Shimon, who'll give it to Levi, he'll give it to Yehuda. So it's the same idea, right? I'm giving you a gift and you pass it on. Now remember that by an etrog, it says in the pasuk, "Lakachtem lachem biyom harishon," right? It has to be, you take for yourself, meaning you have to own it. You can't use an etrog that's owned by somebody else on the first day at least, okay? So says Rav Nachman bar Rav Chisda, let's say a person says to somebody else, the giver says, etrog zeh natun lecha b'matana. I'm giving you my etrog. I used it. It's your turn. It's yours as a gift. But acharecha leploni. But like many gifts, there's strings attached. And after the gift, I want you to give it to Shimon, right? So says the Gemara, says Rav Nachman, natlo rishon v'yatzabo, right? If the first person took it and used it for his mitzvah, he shook the lulav, right, in the etrog, that's a machloket. Was he fulfilled it or not? Banin la machloket, Rebbe, Reb Shimon Gamliel. That's the machloket, Rebbe and Reb Shimon Gamliel. According to Rebbe, so to speak, a gift is only kinyan perot. It's not kinyan aguf, right? Now, of course, perot doesn't mean the same thing. This is a pre, but that's not what perot means, right? Perot means I give you a field, you get to enjoy the fruit of the field, the benefits from the field. Here, but not the actual field. You don't own the actual object because you have to give it over to somebody else. So here too, the fruit, now you can't do anything with this etrog, of course, but you don't own the actual guf, the body of the thing, in which case you can't fulfill your mitzvah. According to Reb Shimon Gamliel, of course you do, and so you can fulfill your mitzvah. So that seems to be the machloket here. Says Rav Nachman, Matkifla Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak.
But this is different. This is metaltalin as opposed to karka.
This is metaltalin, but it's correct, and that is an important point. But remember, we just had two cases of metaltalin as well. Well, avadim are not metaltalin. We had the case of tachrichim, which was metaltalin. But you're correct. This is metaltalin, and it's very different than karka in that way. But
You can give something metaltalin. There's no goof with the metaltalin, really. There's no karka. I mean, it's not
correct.
You can give this away to somebody.
So there is no karka, but there is the guf in this case is the etrog, right? So that's why I say the word pre gets very confusing. But the guf is the etrog, and you want Reuven to give the etrog to Shimon. So Reuven can't do it according to Rebbe. Let's say Reuven can't do whatever he wants with this etrog, and therefore he's not yotzei's mitzvah. But said Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak to Rav Nachman bar Rav Chisda, right? The same name but different father. Matifla Rav Nachman bar Rav Yitzchak. 1 second. This is similar to your point, Ken, by the way. Ad kan lo pligi, Rebbe Reb Shimon Gamliel hatam. Look, over there, the debate was, basically, there were two things that you could get out of this field, right? You can get the fruit out of the field, and you can own the field itself. So there, Mar Savar Kinyan Perot Kikin, a Guftami, Mar Savar Kinyan Perot Lav Kinyan, a Guftami. I understand they had a machloket. Elahacha, similar to what Ken was raising here, if you turn the page to Daf Kuf Lamed Zayin Amud Bet. Hacha imapik la, right? Not map imapik, right? Imapik lo mapik bay, right? If the halacha is that if you use it, you're not going to benefit from it. So the mayavinile. So right, what was the point of giving it as a gift, right? You didn't give it to the guy to eat the etrog. You gave it to him to do his mitzvah, right? You gave it to him to use. In which case, obviously, that was the intent of the gift. So even according to Rebbe, that you might say kinyan perot does not get kinyan aguf. Clearly, in this context, you gave him the etrog to use Ella mepik, right? I'm sorry, you gave him to use Ella, says the Gemara now, second line on Daf Kuf Lamed Zayin Amabet. Clearly, that's a mistake. What you just said, mepik, to use the etrog to fulfill your mitzvah. Kuli amalo pligi nafikba. Everyone agrees, even Rebbe and of course Reb Shimon Gamliel, that this kind of gift allows you to own the etrog to fulfill your mitzvah. The question is, let's say you decide you want to eat it or you want to sell it. Machro, o achla, there banu the machloket Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. There would be a machloket Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, because there again, like the field, you could say maybe I gave you the field to own, but not to have, or the fruits, but not to own it. Here too, maybe I gave you the etrog to do the mitzvah, but not to sell it or not to eat it, not to destroy it, right? Not to get rid of it. Because doing the mitzvah of an etrog, of course, doesn't destroy the etrog, doesn't use it up.
Always give someone the etrog. We say that matana almanat lahachzir. So then, even if he doesn't actually give it to him as a permanent gift, he still can allow someone to fulfill the mitzvah with that tanai. That is a halacha.
That's correct. We're going to have it in a few lines. Yeah, but that's true. But again, it's a little bit different because the question here really is, do you view a gift as being, when you add this clause, right? This is not a matana almanat lahachzir. It's a matana almanat that you give it to the next person. So the question is, how much do you own while it's in your possession, right? Because you have to give it to the next person, right? So it's not so much a condition, right? It's the nature of the gift, which is that if Reuven dies, let's say, it goes to Shimon, right? But what can Reuven do while he's not dead in this case? And so again, the Gemara says clearly you have to look at the intent of the giver. Here, the intent of the giver was to fulfill the mitzvah. That you for sure give over. The question is, can you separate that from owning the etzem, the object itself? And that's a machloket Rebbe and Reb Shimon Gamliel. According to Reb Shimon Gamliel, you can't separate that. Once you've given it to the person to do the mitzvah, they can sell it. It's not nice, but they can. According to Rebbe, they can't, because they have to give it to Shimon after themselves, after they use it. Amar Rabba Barafuna, fourth line from the top. Let's say you have a case of achim. You have two brothers, right? It could be five brothers, but you have brothers. Their father dies, and he leaves them an estate, okay? Now, in the estate is an etrog. If you recall, we don't have this halacha here, an etrog that's owned by partners, you cannot be yotzei, because it has to belong to one person, right? It has to be lachem. So the brothers own this. And remember, we have this case, we've had this many, many times, remember about shkalim especially, where brothers have, or bechorot, for example, where brothers have not yet divided up an estate. And so is everything that's in that estate owned by both of them, or many of them, and their partners, or is it owned individually? They just haven't figured out which one owns what yet, right? So we've talked about this many times in many different contexts. But says Rabba Barafuna, let's say you have brothers that shekanu, they acquire an etrog b'tfusat habayit, right, in the shared house thing. So meaning they haven't, father died, this estate exists, but they haven't split it up yet. And there's an etrog there. So the question is, can one of the brothers pick up that etrog and use it for his mitzvah? So says Rabba Barafuna, natzlo echad mehem, right, v'yatzabo. One of them takes the etrog and he uses it for his mitzvah. So im yachol la'ochlo, if he was able to eat it, meaning had he taken this etrog and said, okay, this is mine, and I'm going to take it home and destroy it, and that would have been acceptable, then yatsa. So if he had the ownership over it, that he could have taken it and used it, then the fact that he used the mitzvah for it means it's his. Im lav lo yatsa. But if he couldn't, right, if the conditions of the estate were that you can't take something and say, I'm taking this and you'll take something else. So the Rashbam says, for example, let's say there were 5 etrogim, right? So we know that we're going to divvy them up somehow. We don't know how we're going to divvy them up. So I take one, and therefore one, someone else will get another one. In that case, you're yotza. But if you're not, if let's say there was only one, or if it was a very contentious family, right, and no one was taking anything, then you can't be yotze. And dafka d'ika etrog l'chol chad v'chad. It means, there's a little bit of debate in the Rashbam whether what Girsa have here, it's talking about where there's one etrog for each person, meaning the father had enough etrogim that there's enough for everyone. And so it's assumed that everyone will get one. We don't know which one you'll get. You take one and that's fine. Avam, the next words take out, the Rashbam says they're from a shota, I think is his language. So we don't really want to have it. The Rashbam says shotimhu, pirush shel shotim, the next 4 words. So we'll take them out. Parish or rimon lo, which means a different fruit. Wouldn't it be the same halacha? He says, take it out. Tosfot tries to explain it, but either way, I think we can stay away from what he calls.
I'm wondering how about this story with the etrog in inheritance. The fruit, etrog, like any other fruit, has a lifespan. So until they inherit it, and we talked about earlier, and we talked about when does the inheritance take effect, and they have to resolve it. And there's a difference between when the person dies and when actually inheritance goes into effect. If this etrog sits in the house for 4 months, 6 months, first of all, the chag is over, and secondly, this etrog is probably worthless because it's dried up and you can't really use it anymore. So at some point, the whole discussion becomes irrelevant.
Well, you could, yes, that's true, but you could say the same thing. I mean, let's say I walk by your store in Erev Sukkot and you have 5 etrogim there and you went away out of town, right? I can't walk into your store and say, these are going to become worthless after Sukkot, so let me just take them, right? That don't, it doesn't, what you're saying is true, but it doesn't mean that it's yours, right?
Exactly.
So-
That's my point. They said may have no value. This whole discussion that they have two brothers and one can split. By the time they have to go through probate, whatever they have to do, it's not even valid to use. So
Right.
it's a moot discussion.
Well, I mean,
I mean, how do you set up the case here so that the father buys the etrog a month before and he happens to drop dead, and they're going to then
How come he has a
negotiate
tree?
the will within 2 weeks before Sukkot? I mean, what's the
So,
scenario?
I mean, look, we come up with very strange situations. So it could be any of those, right? First of all, you could have an etrog tree, but yeah, you could have bought 3 etrogim and he drops dead, Erev Sukkot. So the 3 brothers show up, right? And they don't talk, they don't split it up, like you said. They haven't had probate, they haven't had Shiva yet, let's say, whatever. And one of them takes an etrog and uses it. So the question is that his or not? Does he have to do the mitzvah again? And so the halacha that Rabbi Bar Huna said is that as long as he basically would be, if it had been 3 apples, right, and it would have been okay for one to take one and eat it, that would have been fine as long as there's one for the other people. Then he's Yotzei his mitzvah. Let's get to your case, though, the one you mentioned. So it says the Gemara, Amar Rava, and this is the case we've had before that Ken reminded us of. Etrog zeh natun lecha b'matana. Person says to somebody else, I want to give you this etrog as a gift. Al menat shetachzireo li. I don't want you to go home with it. Right? You've got to give it back to me. So it's a matana al menat lahachzir. Says Rava, natlo v'yatzabo. The guy takes the etrog and he shakes it. He does his mitzvah. He's very happy. However, hichsiro, if he gives it back to the first person, then he's yatsa, right? Because then he had a gift. It was a gift on condition he gave it back. The gift condition was fulfilled. The gift was real. But lo hichsiro, lo yatsa. But if he doesn't give it back, then he wasn't fulfilled his mitzvah because then he stole it basically, right? And it's not his. Kamash Malan, this is the chiddush that many of us know because we already learned this Gemara that matana, not lahachzir, shama matana. That if you give a gift on condition, you give it back during the time that the person has it, it is considered a valid gift. Now, there was a woman. It's a very interesting case. There was a woman, Dahavi la dikla ba'ara de Rav Bibi bar Abaya. Rav Bibi bar Abaya, his father was Abaya, right? Owned land. And in the middle of his land, there was a woman who had a dekel, had a date palm, right? And she used to come and take the dates from her tree. Now, every single time she took the dates from her tree, she would walk in the field of Rav Bibi bar Abaya, and Rav Bibi bar Abaya would scream at her, right? So he sat on his porch with a shotgun, and he would threaten her every time she came by. Says the Gemara, Kapid kol emat havi azla the migzere. Every time she went to cut down her dates, havi kapid aleh. He would scream at her. He would get very angry with her, and he would shout at her that she was trampling his field, that she was, getting in the way of his workers, whatever it was. So you know what she said? Look, she said, I don't need this. I don't really care so much about this tree. I don't want to give you the tree. But listen, as long as you're alive, Rav Bibi bar Abaya, you can have the fruits that come from this tree. Okay, so she said, Akanite nihile kol shnei chayav. You can have this tree as long as you're alive. Okay, so you take it. I don't want to give you the tree. She wasn't selling it to him, right? But she wanted him. As long as you're here, you can have the fruit. Now, this sounds very similar to the case before. So Rav Bibi bar Abaya was like, great, I got a windfall now. But it wasn't enough for Rav Bibi bar Abaya to get a windfall because he knew that when he died, the tree was going to go back to this woman. So he, based on Rabbi Yochanan ben Shimon Gamliel, went and said, not only do I have the tree, but I'm going to give it away, right? But of course, he didn't want to give it away because he wanted it. So Azal Ihu Akni Nihile Libno Katan. The Rashbam doesn't like the word Katan, he takes it out, but he gave it to his son, right? You could say son. The explanation of Katan is that maybe a father has to support his son who's a minor in some cases, right? So he gave it to his son because he otherwise would have had to feed him. So basically, Rav Bibi bar Abaya went and gave it away. Now, of course, the Rashbam asks, we said earlier in today's daf that this is a Rasha Arun, right? A person who takes something that's supposed to go back to the woman when he died, and he's changing the Yerusha, right? So he explains that, in fact, at this point, we're about to go back on it, don't worry. But at this point, we're sort of confident that it's not a case like we had before. Before, the case was where a man gave a gift to Ruvain and said, when you die, Ruvain, I want it to go to Shimon. When Shimon dies, I want it to go to Levi. So clearly you don't want it to stay in Ruvain. You want it to go to Shimon. Here, she didn't say, when you die, Bibi bar Abaya, give it to somebody else. She just said, for your lifetime, because you're the one who's all angry at me. So he assumed that she didn't really care if he took it forever, but she just didn't give it in that way. And he wanted to make a mechanism to do that. A little bit weaker, but anyways, that's how he explained. So that was the case. Amar Rafuna Breit Rav Yeshua said Rafuna Breit Rav Yeshua, that is a ridiculous thing to say. Mishum De'atu mimulai, because they Rashbam understands, and Rashi always understands, is Abaya, and this is Rav Bibi bar Abaya, that Abaya was from the family of Eli. And if you recall that Eli was cursed, that his children would all die when they were young. So Rashi usually understands mulai as like mal, it's like, they're cut off, basically, like a brit milah, that because you come from a family that was cursed, that they would die young, you say things that are not so intelligent. Amrita mila mulita, you say things that should be cut off, meaning things that are not well thought out. So it was basically an insult to Abaya's family. In this case, Rav Bibi bar Abaya, the son of Abaya. The Rashbam has a nicer interpretation that they came from a city called Mulyata, and that's why they were called that. Anyways, says the Gemara, Afilu Reb Shimon Gamliel lo ka'amar ela la'acher. Even Reb Shimon Gamliel said that a person who goes to someone and says, here's a gift to you, Ruvain, and when you die, it goes to Shimon. When Shimon dies, it goes to Levi, that Ruvain owns it and he can give it away or sell it. That's only because the original giver got it out of his possession, right? It's never going back to him. It's going to Reuven, Shimon, Levi, but it's never coming back. So I don't care what you do with it. Avo la'atzmo lo, but he would not have said that in the case where he kept it back for himself. In this case, the woman just said to Rav Bibi bar Abaya, look, you're driving me crazy. So for your lifetime, you can have the fruits. But after you die, it goes back to me, to the old lady who might not be alive, but it goes back to my family. In which case, she would not have given over the power for Rav Bibi bar Abaya to actually sell it or give it away, and therefore the gift to his son is null and void, and there is no gift. And so that is how the Gemara seems to conclude.
Well, it seems like this is a case similar to a landlord who wants to get rid of his tenant in any way possible. So he tries to he doesn't pave the ground. He doesn't clean up the ground. He lets the water drip. And he says, "I'm going to pay you. I'm going to pay you $10,000 to leave." And so she's annoying him, so to speak, but she's walking through his land. He screams at her, and she says, "Listen, okay, I'm going to give. I'll give it to you for a while, but it's really mine. I'm not leaving. So this is, you got no right beyond that. I'm giving you so that you stop. You leave me alone. I'll let you use it, but I'm not giving it to you. I'm just letting you for a while, and then but it comes back to me after you leave. You leave the earth, you move away somewhere.
So I think the Gemara agrees with you. I'm not sure they would use all the same words, but Rav Bibi bar Abaya clearly didn't. But yes, that's what they insulted him. Rafuna Bridge of Yeshua said that he's for sure wrong. Continues the Gemara. Let's finish today's daf. I'm Rav Nachman, 10 lines from the bottom. If you go to someone else and say, look, here's a cow, but I want it back in a week. Okay, now this guy, I'm not sure why you gave it to him. He takes it and he goes to Hektish and said, I'd like to donate this cow to Hektish. And at the end of the week, he goes back to the guy who gave it to him, and says, here's your cow back. By the way, Hektish is going to come pick it up tomorrow, right? So he gives it to Hektish, he donates it to Hektish, and he gives it back to Reuven. Says the Gemara, the Hareza Mukdash or Mukhsar. It belongs to Hektish because while he had it, he had the right to own it and to give it to Hektish, and he gave it back, so he doesn't owe Reuven anything. Says the Gemara, Amrle Rav of Nachman, what? That's ridiculous. Maya Hadre, what do you mean he gave it back to Reuven? He gave it to Hektish. It belongs to Hektish. The fact that the animal's still walking around, he didn't give anything back to Reuven. Ella takes out the next four words. They don't really make any sense. Ella Amar Ravashi, you're right. Chazina. It really depends on what they said when they gave the gift. I Amarle. If Reuven said to Shimon, I'm giving you my cow for a week, Al menat tachsirehu li, tachsirehu, on condition that you give it back, then Hadre, he gave it back. The cow actually came back. Yamalei amanach tachsirehu li. Instead of you give it back to me, that implies you can't give it to Hektish. Then Hadre, then midi techazi lake amalei. He meant something that I could use again, and I obviously cannot use this shard. So therefore, it all depends on what you say, which is the case with all these gifts, right? It always depends on the context. Let's read a few more lines. We'll do it again probably tomorrow morning.
Didn't we learn somewhere that I remember we learned that one can redeem something from Hektish? So couldn't he, this fellow who got it back, redeem it from Hektish?
I mean, it's a really good. So it depends. You can redeem things from Hektish if they're not kachim mizbeach. So maybe this cow was for the mizbeach. But either way, the question, the point that we initially made is that you don't need to redeem it. You can say, look, here's your cow back. It happens to have a different owner now. And so what we're saying now is it depends on what you said. You have to be very careful with your language. If you said, here's my car on condition you give it back to me, right? Then in theory, even if it's totaled and it's creeping up the car, you can't even drive it, then it might be considered to be given it back, right? Which obviously, people play these games all the time, right? What did you say? Give it back to me in working condition, give it back to me with 4 wheels, give it back to me. So it always depends on exactly what you say. So if you just said, you give it back, the fact that it belongs to Hektish now would still be considered giving it back. Let's read a few more lines.
But then if he says you have to give it back to me, and the fellow donates Hektish, then he has to replace the cow, right?
Correct. Yes, then he has to replace the cow. Well, no. First of all, it's a little complicated because then it actually doesn't belong to Hektish, because since the gift, he only got to keep it as long as he gave it back, and he wasn't giving it back, then it won't go to Hektish. So it was never his at that time.
It wasn't. So wait, he didn't give it to Hektish? Is that what you're saying?
Correct. So it turns out that since he didn't give it back, it's well, either way, right? So it could be either that he has to give him another cow, or that it doesn't even belong to Hektish because he didn't fulfill the condition of the gift.
No, wait, well, Hektish can say, listen, this is my cow. How can you what? Right? If he gives it to Hektish, and now he says, no, that I didn't fulfill the condition, it really goes back to the other fellow. When Hektish says, well, this is a cow now, I'm using this cow.
Yeah, but Hektish, but I mean, it's like if I go to Hektish and say I want to give them your car, right? I can't give them someone else's thing. I can only give them my thing.
Let's say, look.
I'm Rav Yehuda Shmuel. Let's do 2 more lines. Says Rav Yehuda Shmuel, Kotev nechasav la'acher. Person goes to somebody else and says, I'd like you to have all my money. Here's $1 million. Va'amar hala, and the other guy says, ef shiba, and I don't want them, right? I don't want your money. Kana. It doesn't matter. He's still koneh. Va'afilo omed v'tzavach. Even if he's standing there screaming, saying, I don't want it, I don't want it. It doesn't matter. Now, this obviously is not true. You can't force someone to take something. We're going to discuss what this means. And Rabbi Yochanan Amar lo kana, right? Rabbi Yochanan says you're not koneh. Let's read it. Yeah, I'm going to read 2 more lines. Amar Rabbi Abba bar Mama v'lo pli. They're not really arguing, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yehuda, because kam b'tzavach meikara. The difference is whether you screamed initially, right? If the guy said to you, here's the gift, and you said, I don't want it, then everybody agrees you don't acquire it. It's not yours, okay? Because in order to acquire something, it has to be something you want. Remember, the principle is, zachin la'adam shelo b'fanav. You can give a zchut to someone not in front of them, but if the person says, I don't want it, it's not a zchut, right? Even if somebody else might want it. But if you came to me and said, here are front row seats to whatever, and I don't want that, that's not a zchut for me, right? So there, of course, you're not kona. But kan, the other case is, Bishotek meikara ubesof tzavach, where you initially were quiet, you watched the transaction, you accepted it, you didn't say anything, and then 5 minutes later or a little bit later, you say, "I don't want it, and I don't want your gift." You thought about it, then it's too late, right? Because then once you can always give it to Hefker, you can always give it away, but you can't undo the gift, and you can't go back to the first person. And we're going to discuss this more tomorrow. Miriam, I think we might have to learn in the morning tomorrow, unfortunately. I'm just a little nervous. I'm not going to feel healthy enough in the afternoon, given my track record. So we could try. Ken, does morning work for you or afternoon work for you? What works best for you?
The morning is better, much better.
Tomorrow, unfortunately, will be 7:45 a.m. Unfortunately for Miriam, but I'm sorry. And next week I'm traveling, so we'll have to figure out when that'll be. So we'll see, God willing.
Okay. Thank you.
Shavua tov,
Shavua
everyone.
tov.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Not traveling. I don't know. I don't know when he's not traveling.